This is the Extra Point Podcast. During this podcast, we will dive deeper into our Sunday teaching and share practical next steps for your faith journey. Now, let's kick off the Extra Point.
Hey everybody, I'm William Ford. I'm an intern here at Southridge Church, and I'm sitting here with Pastor Cheryl Ross as we go over the extra point of the sermon she spoke about yesterday. Can we get an overview kind of that?
Yeah. So it really had a lot to do with how you view other people's success and your reaction to it, whether you choose to celebrate it or whether you choose to ultimately fear it. And it was through 1 Samuel chapter 18 where you see Jonathan and David really become close friends, and they make this pact that's going to kind of serve them in the next coming chapters. But then you have Saul, who has an internal struggle that begins to go on where he begins to see David as the enemy because he chooses to fear it, where Jonathan chose to celebrate it and to kind of share in that and put things aside. But we really ultimately saw that throughout that, they have part of the way that we react to other people's success really comes from the internal things that go on, where we've decided to secure our identity, what we've placed that security in. And so sometimes you have some insecurity because you've secured your identity to the wrong things. And so it can really steer you to react in that kind of fearful, jealous, anger type of way.
Yeah.
Whenever you see other people succeed, whenever you have those things that you haven't really worked through.
I know that I've definitely had those situations, and I think Facebook tends to be the biggest culprit of this. Mm-hmm. You're seeing all this good stuff going on in people's lives, but you know what the bad stuff's going on in yours, so you don't get to see the bad stuff that goes on in theirs. So you just you get a little bit of jealousy.
Yeah.
And I have to fight myself in those moments and be like, no, that's good for them. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this should be praised. So why do we find that so hard to find the joy in other people's success? Yeah. Why is that put on our heart so often?
Yeah. I think a lot of it really does come from that internal stuff that we have going on. It comes a lot from how we maybe define success. If we are defining success by, the prestige, the job, the title, the education, the family, the wealth that's either seen in like houses or cars or whatever, if we're defining success in that way and we don't have that, then when we see other people have those things that we've defined as success or as good things, then it makes us not feel so very, very joyful, right? Yeah. It makes us compare because if we put so much stock in that and rather than the internal success that I think we have, then I think that really, like, you'll see that happen a lot. But if you internally can say, kind of understand your journey and where you're at and understand and not really compare in that negative light, because I think there's a healthy comparison that can go on where like for you personally, like I know where I want to be personally. And so I'm comparing now, like who I am now to who I want to be. And that helps me make those goals and make some strides to get there. Right.
Yeah.
But when we're comparing to somebody else whose journey is totally different than mine, who's gone through all these other things to get there, then when I see that thing that they want, like that I want, then I've compared in such a bad way because internally I have defined success differently, or the route to success maybe is part of it. Because I know for me personally, I've had conversations with like Aaliyah, our other intern, over the past few weeks, where I kind of shared with her a little bit about my journey to get to where I am compared to hers. Like you guys are both in the program, the Trellis program, right?
Yep.
Which is an amazing, amazing program where you guys get to intern here at the church, You're going through schooling. It's helping to pay for your school to where you're going to come out with not just ministry experience, but potentially debt-free from your schooling.
Yep.
That didn't exist when I got started, right? Like nothing. And so when I got started in a ministry, it was very different. And I didn't even really have somebody who was close to me to really speak into a lot of those things. But even my journey getting started into ministry, totally different. However, I know that I do want to go back to school. Like, that's one of my goals. And so I could sit and, like, see the fact that you guys are in school and really get frustrated or upset or jealous or angry or, like, whatever. But instead, I'm celebrating because I'm excited that your journey gets to look different than mine, that it's not going to be as hard as what mine has been.
Yeah.
Like, your journey is totally different in that way. And so I'm able to look at it and be okay with those things and not compare myself negatively, because I know that, like, along my journey, even though it was difficult and there were hardships, I have learned a lot along the way, and gotten to a place, just personally, that I know that, like, when I do go back to school, I'm actually going to be studying in the area that I know that I'm called to do, or that's going to be used in ministry going forward, rather than I could have just started at anything and I maybe wouldn't have understood what my full calling is.
Yeah.
And I probably would have wasted some time on some studies that I shouldn't really focus on.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I don't
It
know.
does. It does make sense. And what I'm thinking about as you're talking here is, the comparison is the thief of joy, but there is some positive comparison that can be had. Like in the instance of me and Aaliyah, God puts people in your path to help teach you and help you grow yourself. And Aaliyah has been that for me, just seeing how she's on fire and how she does things. That gives me a different perspective in going through ministry and looking at how I do things.
Absolutely. And I think, like, joy too, like, if we can focus that our joy comes from that personal relationship that we have with Christ, that we have with God, like our own walk. Like, if you can find joy in that rather than in what you're doing or what you have, because sometimes we put too much stock on that. Like, oh, if I get the house, I'll be happy finally. Like, if I get that new car, I'll be happy finally. If I get that job, I'll be happy. If I get that degree, I'll be happy. Like, sometimes we put too much stock in the things, like, rather than in, like, the personal relationship and the journey getting there. Does that make sense?
Definitely, yes. And in truth, there's that goalpost is always going to move.
Right.
But Christ is constant.
Yes. I love that.
And that's why, God has different jobs and different times for our lives. And we need to lean into Him and trust Him and not our jealousy.
Right.
But how do we go about doing that? In those moments, it's tough,
Yeah, it's absolutely tough. I think back to, like, the story that I shared about my friend Jenny having the opportunities to speak on Mother's Day. Like, that first Mother's Day, it didn't necessarily bother me because I don't even think I was a mom at the time. But, like, after I was a mom and then it continued to be her, I think she spoke maybe 3 Mother's Days in a row. Maybe it was just 2. I don't know. But I remember sitting there kind of starting to feel a little jealous, a little negative towards her, when I shouldn't have at all, because I had said some things to make the lead pastor think that I didn't want that opportunity. Yeah. And I never went back to him. Like, I never had the confidence to go back to him and say, hey, I really feel like I should go in this way. I never did that. You know what I mean? So, like, part of that's on me. That's part of the things that I had to work through personally during all this time before I started in this position I'm in now, and still have to work on, because I wouldn't say that I'm, like, a majorly confident person. Even in the things that I know that I'm good at, like, I'll still be like,
that surprises me, because you seem extremely confident to me.
Well, sometimes what appears and what is really going on inside is different, And I think that's part of why I love this story with Saul, is that, like, all this stuff that goes on even throughout the rest of chapter 18, it's all internal stuff. Like, it's all the thoughts that he's having. It's all these things that, like, he's not going and telling that. Like, he didn't say that out loud to David in that moment. Like, you know what I mean? Why are they doing this to you and not for me or whatever? He didn't do that. It's all inside. Like, it's all internal. And I think for me, that's where I was for a long time in my life. Like, even I can even look back as a teenager whenever there were maybe good things spoken over me or whatever, I never had follow-up conversations about that to say, hey, you know, what you said, I don't understand. How does this look in my life? Or how can I do this? Or I feel led to do this. Can you help me do that? Like, I never did that. I always have been the person that kind of like wants to wait and sit back in the background and like be called on. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like rather than stepping into it. And so some of that is developing some of that confidence, because there's healthy confidence and there's arrogance. Like, I think we've seen the difference probably with people in our lives. And like arrogant people will often step into those things before they're actually ready for it. Mm-hmm. Confident people can step into it knowing that that's what they're supposed to do, and be ready for it.
It's the difference of running in blind.
I think that preparation aspect that Pastor Scott talked about a bit is like huge.
Yeah. And
so some of that trusting is realizing that maybe there's more that you have to do to prepare to be ready for it. And that was, for me, that was 100% what I needed. I needed time to really prepare to get to that place where I could do the thing.
Yeah.
Speak to adults and be confident in it. Like, had I done it in that time, I would not have been confident at all.
I have a very similar story to this, and it just happened this summer.
Yeah.
Aaliyah got to speak on this stage, and for a moment, I was filled with jealousy. I was extremely jealous, but then I looked inward and realized even if I was asked to speak, I would say no, because I'm not ready for this.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, that's where I was like, when I said it second service, I didn't say it first service, but the previous week, Pastor Scott had said, like, oh, I know associate pastors are sitting back thinking, I could do that. I could do that better than them, whatever. And I was like, he is speaking just fully on himself right now, because I don't feel that way. Like, I know we both sat through a meeting with Pastor Scott where he said, hey, where do you see yourself in 3 years? And I was like, he asked me, he's like, do you see yourself as a lead pastor? And I was like, I'm like, if I can do anything, no, like, I will do anything else. Like, I will do it if God leads me there.
Definitely.
I will do it. I will step into that, because at that point, if he does, I'll know that he's like, I'm ready. You know what I mean? But right now, I don't feel ready. I can step in for other things. I told him, I said, do I feel led to preach and teach? Yeah, absolutely. But I can do that whether I'm a lead pastor or not. Right. And so I was like, I'm okay with this until I know that, like, until it's time to do something else. But I also know that right now, like, there's a lot that I am preparing for in this season for the next. When I went on sabbatical, for instance, I remember, and I had conversations with most people on staff beforehand. Well, a couple people at least. I bared my heart and whatever. But I was feeling really lost, because I do know that I'm supposed to preach and teach. Like, that's my highest gifting, is teaching. And I had only done it once before, until after I came, like, for that year, I had only done it once until after I came back from sabbatical. Okay. And I remember I sat over at that altar and I prayed, and I was like, God, if I'm not ever supposed to do this again, okay, but you have to make me okay with this. Like, you have to help me understand what you're doing in this time. You have to give me whatever it is that I need, like, to be okay with this.
Yeah.
But during my sabbatical, God really spoke to me, ironically, through the story of David. Okay. Through 1 Samuel. I began reading through 1 Samuel, and I began to realize that, like, even though you might have the ability to do something, your responsibilities don't always match your ability.
Yeah.
And so you have to be okay in whatever responsibility God has entrusted you with until the time that he's ready to use your ability. And so that right there helped me be like, okay, cool, I'm good. Because a lot of what I do in this role are things that, like, I don't super enjoy. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not a huge administrative type person, but a lot of the things that I'm doing, I'm creating processes and things and administrative stuff that I do behind the scenes.
It's funny how
And
God does that, you know, because while you're internally thinking, I don't really enjoy this, but outwardly you're very good at it, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
it's because, who knows? I don't know. God's cool in the way that he does those things, but like, because I can do it, like I
Yeah.
know I can do it, and I have seen the fruits of when I do this well, like even in kids ministry before I switched roles. I was just talking to Lee about this morning, about how putting those things in place to where like you can work ahead and you can do this stuff, and like really setting that calendar and that weekly flow of things will help prepare you and get you in places where you have more freedom to do the other things or say yes to those other things. I think that was a huge thing that I had to learn before I switched roles, because understanding and seeing that like when you do that, like anybody could step into it.
yeah.
And sometimes the things that you're doing is really for those who are going to come after you and not for you.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the like understanding that in the journey, like the trust that happens in the journey is knowing that whatever you're doing, if you're doing it for God, like if you're doing it for like work, whatever you do it like you're working for the Lord, right?
Yep.
Like that's scriptural. When you actually do it in that way, though, it's really cool to see what happens in the meantime. And so like we see with David, even throughout this, like with this story, I didn't get into the next scriptures. The very next day, it says the very next day, like this 1 Samuel, a lot of times you don't know the timeline of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in this, it says the very next day, what is David doing? After he's defeated Goliath and gone against the Philistines and they come back from war, all the celebration, the very next day, he's playing the harp again for Saul.
Yeah.
The very next day, he went back to that thing, that simple thing that's like nobody would really care about, right?
Yep.
And he's doing it. Even after all the celebration, all the thing like chants and stuff with his name in it, he still went back to do the simple thing.
Now, you're talking a whole lot about being obedient here.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, you're talking about learning
Mm-hmm.
and even your sabbatical, which is taking care of yourself. That
Mm-hmm.
in those moments, that you grow in those moments. And growing is a huge part of our walk as being Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And it leads to us being better. And
Mm-hmm.
I just want to ask you, what does it look like to become a better you?
Yeah. I think this is, again, a very individual, personal question. And I think that's honestly, like, if all of the stuff that I talked about, if we can just focus on ourselves, and I don't mean that in the way that, like, we don't worry about anybody else or ever do anything for anybody.
Yeah.
I'm talking about, like, okay, so my kids right now, they have a very bad habit of trying to assist me in what the other one's supposed to be doing, right? So if I say, hey, just focus on eating right now, don't talk. Like, you need to eat. You only have so much time to eat. Like, we got to eat so we can move on to the next thing, right? If Carter talks during that time, Esme's real quick to be like, Carter, you're supposed to be eating, not talking. But in doing that, what's she doing? Talking and not eating. So in her trying to help somebody else, she is doing the very thing that she's not supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And so we've come up with this phrase like, focus on me, let everyone else be.
I like that.
And it says, focus on me, let all other people be. Like, if I focus on what I'm supposed to be doing as an individual, the specific callings, the specific gifts, and all of that God has given me, and I focus on bettering those things rather than worrying about other people and where they're at with it, then I can actually be better. But when I'm so focused on, so take that example with Aaliyah. because this is one of those moments where I remember thinking, man, her first time up, like, she's that good. Because I remember, I'm pretty sure I struggled for a while,
Yeah.
right? I don't think I was terrible, but I wasn't great either. But within all that, though, like, she's serving under Pastor Scott, who has really, like, perfected a lot of things. Like, he's got a system. I mean, she sat in his office multiple times that week, like, preparing, talking through it, getting the feedback to become better.
Yeah.
Like, she could have just done it. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like, we all were in a meeting where she was like, I wrote a sermon last night.
Yeah.
And we're like, cool. And she could have just gone with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But she wants to learn. She wants to become better. So she went to Pastor Scott. She asked for feedback. She worked throughout it. I gave her feedback in the next steps room while she was working on it. Like, she talked through how she wanted to set up a waiting room, and we talked through, like, the better placement of it. Like, it was a whole team effort to get her there, right?
Yeah.
But she could have just been saying, well, this is my first time. I'm just going to do it and whatever.
Yeah.
And so within that, though, like, we have to realize the stuff that goes on behind the scenes. And so for us, if we want to be a better communicator, if you want to be a better drummer, what has to happen to get you there? It's the stuff that nobody sees, right? Yep. And I think we talked about this a little bit last week in the extra point and stuff too, about that stuff that goes on that people don't see or people don't know that gets you there. It's the hard work that you put in. It's the, education that you're doing and going through right now. It's reading books. It's all of those things. It might also look like counseling to work through some issues. Mm-hmm. Okay, so for me personally, I had to go through some counseling. And what I realized, part of my confidence and not wanting to speak up and say, like, hey, I could do that or whatever, comes from trauma and some things that I experienced as a kid.
Yeah.
And I had to understand, like, as a kid, I felt like my voice was taken from me. And so working through that and understanding that, I realized that I'm very hesitant to use my voice to speak up or speak into things, even though I might know, because I was quieted a lot as a kid. It's why I'm very much like try to tell my kids, like, what you say matters and all of these things, because I want them to know, like, and be confident in speaking their opinion and speaking their, like, not in a negative way. Like, we work a lot on tone and all those things.
Got to be tactful.
So, like, it may look like counseling. There may be some things that, like, I know this is going to sound really, like, fluff or whatever, but, like, getting in your feelings.
Yeah.
When that rises up and you're, like, a little bit of jealous of somebody and what they're doing, okay, why do I feel that way? Like, where's this coming from? Is it because I haven't put in the work? Is it because, whatever? Is it because somebody told me as a kid that I would never be a good speaker? Like, you know what I mean? Like, there are things a lot of times that follow us, but a lot of times we haven't done the work to actually figure out why we're feeling a certain way and where it really comes from. Because I would say the majority of times when we feel those negative emotions, we probably felt those initially at some point in our life, and it's followed us because we've never done the work to, like, really flesh it out.
Yeah.
And
you
even
deeper.
replace that, like, those thoughts. Like, because that internal thought stuff that's going on with Saul and all of that, and for us in our lives too, it comes from stuff in the past a lot of times, and it follows us if we do not really work through that. And so becoming a better you could be fixing, like, healing the old you.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. We are told through Scripture to hold every thought captive, and I think that's part of it is taking those feelings or thoughts, those things run together, and you need to take it, dig down, and understand it to fully overcome these things that are difficult for you. And it's a big part, I think, of becoming a better you is, as you're saying, that may look like going to a counselor or me and Savannah. We generally, at least once a week, sit down and talk about our feelings, talk about our week, and kind of analyze what's going on in our lives.
Yeah, and that creates a better marriage, right?
Yeah.
That creates a better us, like when you're doing those things. And so it's a lot of those things, that internal stuff, but it's also, I think it goes back to that trusting the timing. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Like, a good marriage is not built in a day.
No.
Right?
No, yeah.
And so, like, working through it in those times and remembering that along the journey, every moment, every day, every conversation, all of that, every book you read, every podcast you listen to, every class you take, all of that's going to lead to things in the future that you don't even know, like can't even imagine right now. And what's really cool within the story of Saul and David within this is that every time Saul actually tries to come against David, we see that David's successful, right?
Yeah.
Saul is like the one person in this chapter who is against David. Everybody else, like his officers, love him. It says that the Israelite army like welcomed the appointment that was given to David. Like they were ecstatic about it. Like Jonathan loved David. You see that like Saul's daughter Michal loves David very much. Like, and it pleased the people. And so everybody really, like, they're all for David. And every time that he tries to say like, oh, well, I'll do this so he'll get killed by the Philistines, he ends up being successful over the Philistines, right?
Yep.
Like, and he ends up becoming, like, his name becomes well known and he becomes famous. And it's because God is with him through it all, right? Like, God has a plan and a purpose for David, and nothing can come against that. Yes, things will try, but they won't succeed ultimately. And so I think that's part of remembering along the way as you're becoming a better you, as you're looking to trust God and his timing, and looking to really be able to celebrate those moments of other people along your journey, is remembering that, like, if you're following after God and what he's has for you, remembering that no matter what happens along the way, even if it's a setback, even if it's, something that's hard or difficult or feels terrible because maybe you lose friends along the way, maybe, whatever, realizing that all of those things are ultimately going to lead to what God actually has for you and the best, and remembering that, like, if it's in God's will, nothing can really hinder that.
That's great. That's great stuff. That's really a message that we need to take away from this, that if it's God's will, we don't need to worry about it. We just need to work towards it. We need to be obedient.
Don't need to worry about it. Just need to work towards it. That's good.
So it was great discussing this. We will be back next week with another extra point in our Rise and Fall series. So if you would like to like and subscribe, do that, and you will keep up to date with us. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to The Extra Point. Be sure to subscribe to the Southridge Church podcast and tune in every Wednesday for another episode of The Extra Point.